on there instead of Asma.
What group? Patrick, because he's not on any of these ones. What group is he?
I don't know, Patrick, did you have a choice?
Are you talking about the list that was online?
The interest groups, yeah.
Yeah, so I was interested in the concept development in children.
All right, there you go.
Okay. I'll add you to it.
All right, so,
I was wondering.
yeah. Okay, so Nathan, I'm turning it over to you here, and what we'll have initially is the L1, L2 presentation. And I think for the discussion on this, it might be the best idea to have all of the presentations, and then as they're going along, you can either in chat put a question or jot it down. Maybe put a question in chat, and then that way during the question and answer, people in the interest group can look through the questions that are being posed, pick out 2 or 3 and talk about them.
Okay, but are we not doing the reading first?
No, we start with the best.
We're doing presentation first?
Yeah.
Well, can we do the reading first? Because we need to fix Mohammed's video and he's in my group, so I'll fix it with him.
It's okay, it's okay. If we want to do the presentation, I can do it without the camera, it's okay.
Yeah, we can
okay,
start.
Yeah, as long as the share screen is working, I have no problem.
Okay. Do you guys want to go first then?
Nathan?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Were you saying you and Mohammed are the only ones in the interest group?
No. I was saying I thought we were going to interest groups first because then I could help him with this camera problem because we're in the same group.
Yeah, we are going to interest groups first.
Oh, okay. So then never mind.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one question. Tasawwar Shah, what do you go by another name or what interest group are you in?
So this is me.
Okay, yeah, what interest group are you in?
I'm in child development.
Okay. Development,
it's
learning of
Asma.
children from birth to adolescence. Okay, I think that should be good. So you want me to open up the groups?
Well, we're going to do your presentation. Do you want to put them in groups during your presentation?
No. Okay, I'm confused. We're doing the presentation first then and not the interest discussion?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Mohammed, do you guys want to go first? And Dwight?
Okay, just let me check if everybody is here or?
Yeah, everyone's in this meeting.
Okay, so I'll share the screen right now, okay? Host disabled participants screen sharing. Can you enable it, please?
It should work now? Okay, cool.
Is it
And
working?
yeah, everyone in the top right on the videos, there are 4 options. There's like two lines, 1 box, 1 line, and then 9 dots. Those ones, you can mess with those options and resize the screen so you can see other people's videos or only this one. So there's a lot of different options if the video pictures are in the way of the presentation. And Tasawwar, if you mute yourself, then you won't show up on everyone's video.
Asma is her first name.
Oh, Asma? Okay.
Yeah, Tasawwar Shah is her husband, and she and Shah and their children are like family to me. So now do you want to record this, Nathan?
It's recording.
But we don't. Okay, go ahead. That's fine. That's fine.
So shall I start? Hello.
Yeah, go.
Test.
Yes,
Test.
start.
The sound is clear, yeah?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so let's start. Okay, so throughout the history, education has been used as a tool to enforce hegemony, where the dominant groups try to spread their influence on other. And although modern education system emerged as a moral and just, more moral and just than the old methods of education, they are still an arena where hegemony can take a place. Hegemony in this sense would be defined as the social, cultural, ideological, or economic influence exerted by dominant group. In the history of the US educational system, hegemony has presented itself in many ways. In some cases, it took the shape of national policies. Other time, hegemony was hidden in the curriculum. Spring 2012, that's the person, not the season. He discussed the attempts of colonial powers to deculturalize the Native Americans and how education was used in that sense. He defined deculturalization as a cautious attempt to replace one culture and language with another that is considered superior. The sense of superiority here, if you remember in one of the classes where Holbrook talked about civilizing the barbarian, Spring also followed the same thinking. He says that the sense of superiority in the European settlers came from their rooted beliefs that it's their duty to civilize and spread Christianity to the rest of the world. And in their quest of civilizing, they have implemented they used educational methods to enforce their hegemony. He mentioned many approaches to deculturalize the Native Americans in education. And one of them is the ban of other languages in schools. This, with time, can result in a cultural genocide by replacing the Native American cultures or the existing cultures with Anglo-American ones. Assimilation is another way to deculturalization. Where educational programs absorb and integrate cultures into the dominant group. This method is very famous in the educational system, where schools or the educational system try to integrate immigrant groups into the mainstream American culture. No child left behind. Okay, and the idea that education could empower a marginalized group, the marginalized group, to free themselves from the dominant culture, led to the use of denial of education to ensure the control of the ruling group. These policies and others mentioned by Spring shows how education can be used as a tool of hegemony. Woodson in 1979 also talked about how education, how hegemony was represented in education. However, his approach, he used a historical thinking approach to focus more on the influence of the educational system on the African American communities during his time. In his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, he mentioned that the problem of holding the Negro down, therefore, is easily solved. When you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his action. You don't have to tell him not to stand here or to go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no backdoor, he will cut one for his special benefits. His education makes it necessary. So the basic claims of Whitson were that the US educational system culturally indoctrinate blacks instead of educating them. He claimed that the American educational system at his time influenced black to become dependent and to search for substandard position in the society, a society where they are a part of. And also the education system was unsuccessful in supporting the blacks due to the lack of structure, of the necessary infrastructure in comparison to the prominently white schools where adequate facilities were presented to them. Also, he said that the educational system neglected the actual contribution of the African Americans to the history. Thus, it whitewashed history. And some of the African Americans also helped to expand this issue by teaching whitewashed version of history to the future generation of blacks. This point we will return later on. Abels also agreed with the Spring and Wilson on the idea that schooling can maintain the influence of hegemonistic group or the dominant group. However, he primarily analyzed the social reproduction of education and economic social relation. He said that institution of cultural preservation and distribution like schools create and recreate form of consciousness that enables social control to be maintained without the necessity of dominant groups having to resort to overt mechanism of dominance. We can link this to what Wilson say about some of the African Americans helped to expand the whitewashed version of history. Moving on. He also stated that in order to understand education, we should situate it back into the both an equal relation of power in the larger society. And he also said that we need to understand the new liberal point of view, because their view is more into modernizing the society, or their view on modernizing societies are based on commodification, privatization, and marketization of educational problems. Also, current curriculum of common culture is saturated with capitalistic's value, survival for the fittest. In other words, they are standardized and based on social Darwinist competition. And they are also encouraged by authoritarian publicists. And if you saw them in the educational forums or TV, you will understand that authoritarian publicists are the conservative groups or religious fundamentalists and evangelicals whose voice in the debate over social and educational policies are now increasing powerfully. Excuse me. Anion 2011 asserted that the education system can validate a cultural capital. Cultural capital will be explained by my colleagues, so we won't go further in it. However, validate a cultural capital as a legitimate, thus implies it is correct. The same with the white version of the whitewashed version of history. Consequently, curriculums can be biased, and selective traditions can be recreate forms of conscience. Selective traditions here means the knowledge that is chosen to be taught in the school. And this is an area where we all as an educator should think about what kind of knowledge or that should be taught in schools, who make the decision of that knowledge to be represented in school. And finally, without a fundamental change in the educational system, it would keep reproducing the same ideology. Dwight, do you want to take it from here?
Certainly. So, yeah, great. So kind of as Mohammed had discussed real briefly before, the section that I focused more on was cultural capital and sort of understanding the aspects that are behind that. So what I did is try to break it down into some relatively simple terms if everybody isn't ultimately familiar with what cultural capital is. Sorry, let me fix my screen. So essentially what cultural capital is it's knowledge that is based in the individual culture of people. It helps us in our ability to navigate as far as social situations and our education and skills that we use in everyday life. The difference between what cultural capital versus any other type of education or experience is that this is specifically based in cultural scenarios, in that each, from what I came across, it was that each culture can actually possess a different set of skills based on the individual experiences that a person goes through, sort of like a nexus point of knowledge, in that it really can vary from social group to social group. So in a nutshell, it's very much tied to a person's individual culture as far as their life experiences go. One other thing that I found definitely tied to our understanding in Vygotsky was the conceptual nature that sort of all of this occurs in. So it was very hard to find where the research studies would either like quantify or show like an actual quality of the individual cultural capital, just because it's very theoretical and conceptual in nature, and a lot less of, I guess, in a physical world of being able to measure it. So it's definitely a very unique sort of concept that we're dealing with here. If I can have whoever's controlling it, Mohammed, move to the next one. Okay, sorry. So why is cultural capital important? It's important to us, specifically the way that we were looking at it in our presentation, as applying to L1 and L2 education in the classroom. It can help to build a more robust narrative for students. It can expand our own understandings of just basic concepts inside of the classroom by being able to use this sort of nexus point of knowledge of bringing in different cultural perspectives versus, like Mohammed was talking about, the very whitewashing of education, or the hegemony of what we've been taught to learn and regurgitate just as information, versus taking in these new perspectives. Another thing that we found is that in doing this and having this present, it sort of creates this more inclusive voice for culture, and specifically in this regard in education. So it's not, again, just time and time again this whitewashed education, or this specific type of history that we're personifying in a never-ending cycle of, well, this is the history that we're going to present, and there's no other viewpoints that can come into the focal lens here. So that's why this is one of the, I guess, more or less a very important thing to consider, in education. And I think that kind of covered that. Thank you. So in thinking about how it can best be applied, or how we can use it, if we use it as a theoretical framework for how we educate L1 and L2 students, we can again create this more, I don't want to say fuller picture, but a more colorful picture of what is actually education is, or what we should be teaching, versus using a few primary colors, if that analogy sort of makes sense. It can also be used to examine inequality among education that we provide to students. So looking at that from the student's perspective to see if we're providing the same level of education to all students, you know, not just based on, I guess, what their intelligence level is or what they're able to take in, but what they should be being taught as well. So, you know, again, more of a difficult thing to quantify and look at it as far as, well, are we actually, I guess, dollar for dollar, being able to offer the same education to this student as this one. It's more of a, you know, a very, very conceptual look at education, and that, are we doing things in a equitable manner versus a non-equitable manner. And then, okay, sorry, my screen blacked out for a moment, but the last thing that I found that we could potentially use this for was to combat the current hegemony that Mohammed was talking about that exists in education. So it's really fighting against this system of this is what we're going to teach, this is what you're going to need to learn, and just regurgitate that information. But it really creates this whole new area where we can actually learn new things and have new theories evolve, and just basically have again a more open and dynamic educational system than what we have known. So yeah, I definitely think it's really a positive thing that that cultural capital represents. So that is it for the section that I did, and I think Kristen is up next.
Yep. And so building on what Mohammed and Dwight had both mentioned is that we've moved, so it's up to the educators in the classroom, right? They both kind of touched on this, on how we would counter hegemony, or we could build up or support the learner's cultural capital. And often what you'll see is this is phrased as student-centered learning or student-centered classrooms. And two of the particular approaches to student-centered learning that I think kind of fit here are the kind of the democratic approach to education. So in the schools where students are encouraged to stand up and speak their ideas and state what they want to learn. Also critical pedagogy, which directly aims to acknowledge hegemonic aspects and then design the curriculum to counter them. So overall, just student-centered classrooms can help overcome these things by allowing the students to interact with each other while they learn, but also with the educator, where the teacher, and you've mentioned this, Holbrook, in some of the talks already, that the teacher is really more of a facilitator, not just this dispenser of information, but helping them learn how to think through processes on their own, instead of just giving them content to download. And then the students, again, are given a voice around issues that matter to them. And also in the democratic approach, they would really, even to some extent, provide input on the instructional strategies that they wanted to use or that they felt were effective for their personal and cultural capital. And so then just some other things that we thought Vygotsky let us think about, or either had in line with the hegemony, is just that it's this historical thinking approach. So based on his process of thinking, if we as educators keep in mind the long term of what brought us into the classroom, what brought the students there, the whole process, not just who showed up because today was the day we needed to teach this course, but what happened to bring them to this point, and also the materials that we're using in the class, where did they come from, what was their process of creation, are we thinking about, you know, the whitewashed version of history here, or is this a more accurate tool that we can be giving the students to learn from? And then we have sort of the same kind of what Vygotsky can help tell us about cultural capital. Vygotsky's work says social and cultural activity give rise to consciousness, and so we can't understand consciousness without it. Therefore, we can't ignore the influence that cultural capital has on a student's stages of concept information. And then also I'd add to that, that even if teachers attempt to model thinking processes, if they use exclusive language, it may affect a student's ability to generalize and develop concepts. Then the everyday concepts are dependent on environmental and emotional characteristics. So again, teachers cannot ignore the effect that their word choice has on student emotional characteristics. And I think this also speaks to hegemony in education. Then we have the academic concepts are based on everyday concepts, which are formulated by the environment. So if the environment is influenced by cultural capital, then the higher functions development is mostly influenced by historical development and formed during the transitional age that we're read about or saw the videos about this week. That again, dependent on the environment and sociocultural development, which are influenced by cultural capital, right? So you can't have that without the cultural capital. Scaffolding is culturally dependent. So we kind of see this when we talk about the zone of proximal development and the zone of proximal practice, which both rely on the understanding of student sociocultural influence, referred to as cultural capital. And so here we just have a little bit, I think we often see Vygotsky cited when we're reading about student-centered learning, or I liked the Russian word for both teaching and learning, that it places the student in control of their own scholarship. So his theories teach us that constructing knowledge with those that know how, so it would be the instructor and the peers in the classroom, letting the students learn from each other as well. And the students' prior knowledge, which again would include cultural capital, is acknowledged as a key part of their development. Environment in which we grow up will influence how we think and what we think about. And so teachers should help students gain the skills, again, to summarize, question, clarify, and predict. So that the teacher's role in the learning process would be hopefully reduced over time. And then I think we, sorry, I misunderstood. I didn't realize, Holbrook, that you wanted the classmates to have discussion ideas. So we have a few ideas posed here if anybody wants to talk about these or if anything came up in the chat box.
It's your time now, Holbrook.
Holbrook, you're muted.
And Nathan.
Yeah,
aren't you-
I have a separate presentation, but I didn't know if we wanted to do the discussion first or.
No, I think we should move on to yours.
Okay. Cool.
All right.
So-
I'll stop sharing now. Huh?
Yeah, stop sharing and then I can share mine.
Okay.
Okay, can everyone see my mouse?
Wait, before you get started, may I ask if we will have access to this PowerPoints that you guys have?
Yes, I'll put them up in the resource library.
Cool. Okay, so I decided to do a presentation separately from my classmates, but they were cool with that. And there are some similarities between theirs and what I'm doing. And so in this program, I want to focus on second language teaching and mostly on something called communicative language teaching. And within that, there's something called task-based language teaching. So today I'm going to show how my views of teaching kind of correlate with Vygotsky's views or try to find some similarities. So my view of a second language classroom. I believe in accuracy over fluency. I believe learning by doing and interacting and not by listening or watching. I think it should be student-centered. And I think we should focus on communication over grammar. So I think we've learned a lot in this class about the origins, where things come from. So the way I came across this was, we've all studied a second language before, and in the classroom, it's very teacher-centered most of the time. And you're not really speaking very much, and while you're doing it, you're filling out blanks in the book, and it's not really real. Communication in real life is spontaneous, and so in order to have practice in the classroom, it should mimic real life so that we can have spontaneous communication. And I don't feel a teacher-centered classroom gives enough to students so that they can speak. So how I came across this approach was in 2012, I graduated from UNM with my bachelor's degree, and I moved to Prague, Czech Republic. I never wanted to be an English teacher, but I just did it because it was the easiest way to make money. So I became TEFL certified, and while I was in Prague, I was a terrible teacher. I knew absolutely nothing about grammar. Students would ask me grammar questions and I would say, I don't know the answer to that, or that doesn't matter. Communication is all that matters, because I couldn't teach them. So there's no way I could teach grammar. But as I started learning, my process actually was working very well for the students. They were all starting to speak more, because every student you come across says, oh, the worst thing they're usually at is speaking. And that's because the classrooms do not have speaking in them. So as I became a better teacher and I had more knowledge, I came across task-based language teaching. And it's what I focused my master's thesis on. So today I'm going to show us how this branch of teaching that uses communication over grammar and how we can apply that to Vygotsky's theories. So what is task-based language teaching? Maybe some people have heard of it, maybe some people use it, and maybe this is something new for everyone else. And when I've taught other teachers about this, they've all said, oh, I actually use this in my classroom. So it'll be cool, maybe some people today can learn something new and have what they can type into Google to learn more about their own approach on how they teach. So task-based language teaching is a branch of communicative language teaching. It places an emphasis on authentic language in the classroom. So authentic language is just real. Whenever you have a grammar textbook and it says, oh, please use this template to speak, that's not authentic communication. That's not real communication. So the idea of tasks is you place students or learners in groups where they have to accomplish something, where they need to work together in order to accomplish a goal. And so when you place these learners into different tasks or groups, they're forced to interact and work with each other in order to accomplish it. And so all of a sudden, the language is not what the class is about, but the class is about achieving or accomplishing the goals or completing the task. So you remove this aspect from the classroom that says the language is the most important thing, and now they must use that language in order to accomplish the task instead. So within that, there's a branch of task-based language teaching called focus on form. And this is what I focused most of my research. This is what my entire thesis was on, focus on form. So it's student-centered. It uses communicative tasks focusing on grammar and communication. So communication is the most important thing, but we can also focus on grammar. So this approach was created in 1988 by this guy, Michael Long. He was studying French Canadians in Canada, and he saw that whenever I was placing my students in communicative tasks, they were all speaking very well. After 2 years, they were very, very good at speaking, almost fluent, but their accuracy was still very bad. So we thought there has to be a way to where we can have accuracy and fluency in the classroom at the same time. So we developed a focus on form approach. So the goal is we want to place students or learners in tasks where they have to use communication, but it's focused on a grammar form in order to complete it. So the idea is you can put them in these groups, in these tasks, but then at the same time, the teacher can intervene always. So me as a teacher, I can teach them a grammar form, and then at the same time, they can work on it, and I can still interrupt them and say, hey, maybe you're not doing this correct. Maybe this is how you need to use the verb or the grammar correctly. So we still focus on using tasks, but still the learner should be using some type of grammar, and they're using the grammar in real life situations, and that will help them acquire it and use it correctly in future use. So this is an example of a focus on form task. So a focus on form task, so let's say the target grammar form we want to use is present progressive or past progressive. So me as a teacher, I can go up to the board, I can teach them about present or past progressive. I don't have to, but I can if I want to. But then I place the students in groups of 4 or 5, and I have them look at this picture. There's so much going on in this picture right now. So I have them create a story about what they think is going on. And since there are so many actions going on, they will be forced to use present progressive or past progressive tense no matter what. So all of a sudden they're using these grammar forms, but not to learn it, but they're doing it because they have to use them to complete the task. they're thinking in these grammar forms. Instead of just filling in the blank in the book, they're saying, oh, she is climbing up the stairs. He is parachuting in. He is jumping off the pencil or the diving board. He is making a snowman. So all of a sudden they're forced to use the correct grammar in order to complete the task. And then always after someone does a task or a group does a task, they should always present it to the class, because not only are they going to try harder if they have to present it, but then also they can discuss similarities and differences. So in this style of teaching, there's so much more interaction in the classroom. All of the students are always speaking with each other, working with each other constantly. So instead of having a teacher-centered classroom, everything is about the students. I'm purely there to facilitate. I'm up here teaching them about present progressive, past progressive, but then I put them in this task to where they have to work together in order to accomplish the task goal, which is to create a story using past or present progressive. So this is how I think that this links to Vygotsky's work. So the zone of proximal development, Holbrook said, okay, this is made for child development. It's not made for this. Or not necessarily, it wasn't designed for a second language classroom. It was designed for child development. But I think that there are some similarities between both of them. So in the focus on form approach, the teacher provides clear scaffolding to the student. So here, I can teach the student about past or present progressive first. So I'm giving them scaffolding. Maybe it's something they don't know yet, or they don't know how to use it yet, or they don't know the correct situation to use it. So when you place them in here, so the students are here, what they can do on their own. By scaffolding, then they're maybe able to do it better, learn with help. But then when you put them in groups, in tasks, maybe this learner already knows how to use past progressive or present progressive. Or maybe this one does, or maybe these three don't at all. But now they're receiving more interaction with more knowledgeable people inside of their own group. So the teacher provides knowledge, but then also one of the students provide knowledge as well. Because when you come to higher levels of teaching or higher groups, like upper, intermediate, advanced students, they've all had so many teachers in their life, and there are many learner differences. So one may know something that the others don't. It happens all the time. So by putting them in tasks, they also become their own teachers for their group. So all of a sudden, like I said, the language is now the tool, and that tool is used to socialize and interact to accomplish the task goal. Hold on. Okay, yeah, so what levels do students need to be on in order to use these teaching techniques? So since it's communicative language teaching, obviously there needs to be some amount of communication. So I'm familiar with the European framework, so I think maybe B1 or above, so that's about intermediate or above. So the students need the ability to communicate to accomplish these. This is not for a beginner classroom, I don't think. So anyways, they use the language as a tool. So now all of a sudden, it's not a language classroom, it's a task classroom. And the task is to create the story using past or present progressive. Then they need to use the language as a tool to accomplish that goal. And so they have to interact with each other the entire time. And they have to create their own meanings. They have to think about, okay, this is what this picture's showing. They have a visual cue, and then they have to internalize it and then speak about what they're seeing too. So they have to attach meaning to the picture and to their words, and then use it through interaction. And then, like I said, interaction with more advanced learners can facilitate acquisition, and it's active learning. The students are actively involved the entire time. So when I teach with this approach, if my class is 1 hour long, I only teach for 15 or 20 minutes, and then the other 40 minutes is them using tasks, 30 minutes to complete the task, and then 10 minutes to present and discuss. So that's 40 minutes of discussion time or interaction time in the classroom. So my goal is just to facilitate them, not to actually teach. Let's see, okay. So this is how I also think it links to Vygotsky. So learning through social interaction. So speaking, Vygotsky said speaking and thinking are separate things. They're completely separate. So we have H, we have hydrogen is speaking, and O, oxygen is thinking. By themselves, they are completely separate things. But then in a task, they need to form together because the students need to speak, but then they also need to think. So the idea of these tasks is combining speaking and thinking together. And so I think that goes perfectly in line with what he's trying to say. And so the idea of these tasks or working together to accomplish things is you're no longer just learning. You're not sitting in the classroom filling in the blank in a book. You're having to think of answers. You're having to think of meanings because you have to constantly work with each other socially. And so if we see this picture, the student has to see this picture. They have to understand what that picture is in their minds, and then they have to speak it to another learner who then has to think what they think this means and then compare it to their students or their other group mates, what they think that means as well. So they're constantly having to think of what the meanings are of these pictures. Oops. So I think this can also improve the thinking process through interaction. So you're teaching them not just how the language works, but they have to think in the language. And I think that's really important, is they're thinking in the language. They're not just using it, they're thinking it. And they're having to think of what these meanings mean, how they're able to use it. Let's see, I have some chats. Let me look real quick. Okay. So let me go to the end. Sorry, I was reading the chats that you guys were putting. So we can use these words, these tasks to interact, to stimulate thinking. All of a sudden, if you place a student in this and they're thinking like, oh, I've never actually thought of someone jumping off of a pencil as a diving board before. All of a sudden, it's making them think differently. They're having to think creatively, and it's really authentic. It's not this fake classroom language where you say, you must use this. They have no choice but to use past progressive or present progressive in using this because there's no option. They cannot accomplish the task unless they use the grammar correctly. So the grammar is the tool for them to complete the task. So yeah, I think this is the main thing. I think it goes back to Vygotsky, how we have speaking and thinking as separate things, but then in this task, they combine in order to complete the task, in order to interact with each other, the social interaction. And that's my presentation. I'm done. I have these discussion questions. If anyone has questions in the chat, can you please put it and I can try to answer it. And so the focus on form approach goes incredibly deep. I just gave you a very general view of it. But if you have any more questions, I'm glad to help.
Okay, well, let me just jump in here and say that you all have set a good bar for the other interest groups, and all of it was very interesting. And I think I was looking through the chat and I didn't see a whole lot of questions there. And so what I've done is I've created a board. Let me get,
Let me stop sharing my screen, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to get the visual there. Okay, so I've created in the discussion a place for questions and comments on it. And I think this is a place that everybody can jump in and make comments, then the presenters can go and answer them, and you can carry on a bit of a discussion there. And I think rather than doing sort of whole group discussion right now, which eats up time pretty quickly, and I do want to move on, but what I want to do is to spend a couple of minutes just reacting to the presentations. And as I said, I thought everybody did an excellent job. One of the concepts that you run into in LLSS is this concept of cultural capital. And it's pervasive. It's part of sort of the more progressive educational literature. And so I know that the Anion reading was one that some of you did with Rick Meyer in 640, and others may have had it as well, but it's pervasive. And there's two sides of that concept. On the one hand, you take the concept of capital And what is the concept of capital? It's very, very clearly defined. Marx wrote 3 huge volumes on it, what it means and how he is using that concept. And in there, it's a accumulation of wealth within a particular economic system. And so to then take that concept, take it out of the situation, the field in which it was developed and hugely complexly described, and to take just one aspect of that accumulation and then transfer it to other fields like education. And I think Dwight pointed out, you know, what I'm talking about here, in that the disconnect between the theory and the practice is stark. And it's because there isn't a scientific analysis of how that concept is being used. It's just taking a very general concept and then applying it to reality, as opposed to looking at reality and developing the concept. And that's a complaint that all of you have heard me express, or almost all of you have heard me express over the years, and that is the lack of specificity about the concept that we're using. There are so many concepts that have general meaning, like identity and personality, emotion, and they get filled in all different kinds of ways. And it's really important for you, and I think this is something that will come up in our close reading. It's really important to not assume that the meaning that you have about a word from your own experience is necessarily the way that the word is being used. It's really important to think about what is that concept that's being conveyed in that word. Another perfect example that runs through the seminar is the concept of meaning. You know, in education, you see all the time in the literature, meaning making. Well, what are the origins of meaning? How does it develop? What's the motion behind it? What is its essence? And that's why it's important to be clear. And that's what Vygotsky spent almost all of his life doing. His major work was clarifying this concept. And that's lacking in the concept of cultural capital, because there is not that scientific analysis of exactly how that word is being used. It's just used in a very general way. That having been said, you see the disparity between the theory and the practice. And in the practice, these notions and the measures, the ways that they should be implemented are extremely important. Understanding the child's background. We can never understand anybody, another culture deeply. We can only understand it to a certain extent, and we should do that. But it's important to get to know our children, and it's also important to fight for our students, because our students right now in the educational system in this country, and I'm sure around the world, it varies from place to place, but are victimized by education. And you think about that concept, that education is hurting students. And that's what's happening in schools that are driven by standardized curriculum, standardized testing, this accountability that's all for the people doling out the money in Washington. Teachers and administrators' opinions are not valued. And the end result of it is that we have schools, classrooms in which students are bored, and their lives are not reflected in the classrooms. And so those things are really important for that. The concept, the motivation behind the concept is important, but I don't think that the concept itself is adequately developed. And so having said that, I want to move on to the other portion, Nathan's portion. And all of you know, having experienced it or being caught up in a system, that the way that second languages have been taught historically in this country, in Britain, that which influenced the way it was taught around the world, it's been very much grammar based. And that's true no matter if you start early on, where you're getting children just to memorize a lot of things and learn rules and rules of pronunciation. And learning rules is not the way that we learn language. None of us knew any rules about language, grammar, when we developed our first language. We did it through social interaction. And in that social interaction, we began to understand the structure, the syntax, and the grammar. And then there's more explicit instruction in school. And as most of you, any of you who have had some English grammar, there's very few students who put that at the top of their favorite class, because it's all very sort of descriptive and prescriptive. And so there's been a big resistance to this, or trying to fundamentally change this over the last few decades, with a number of different approaches. And the communicative language approach or teaching is certainly among those, and one that I think has a lot of merit because of the concept of interaction. And what in Nathan's presentation, there's a balance, and I think it's important to focus in on that balance. And he tipped the scales heavily with authentic communication. And I remember when I first started teaching ESL in Los Angeles, I was given a book that was, the whole book was written in the present progressive tense. And that the language was just totally clunky, because you can't, in authentic communication, you cannot use one tense. And you think about how children gain a concept of tense. And if we look at that, then we can see how tense time, understanding of time relations, fits into language development. But that understanding comes through their interaction. It doesn't come through learning the rules. When you're dealing with adults, like Nathan was talking about, the expectation is even greater that you do, or high school students, that you focus first on grammar, that's the only way to learn grammar. And so there is resistance to communicative approaches, because you're not necessarily fulfilling their needs. And so within a group, there's, you know, to do this task, it's a present progressive. He is doing, I am doing. But in real life, we rarely use the progressive tense talking about ourselves. And the same with in the past, we do a bit. But from the very beginning, language includes all of the tenses. When the first early humans gained meaning, and in gaining meaning, gained the past, remembering, so that memory becomes part of their visualization, and the future, so that they can begin planning. And so right from the very beginning, those tenses, time, is built into the very structure of language. And so there's different approaches. I sometimes find that in giving students a task, I let them jump in and begin doing the process and working it out themselves, as opposed to having an explicit grammar lesson and rule that then governs what's supposed to be authentic communication.
Well, yeah,
And
you could also do implicit, where you wouldn't do that. You would just give them a picture where they would have to do it anyways. They wouldn't realize. So there is implicit and explicit focus on form.
Yeah, great. Thanks for chiming in. And this is, Nathan and I can have further discussions. I've read his thesis, and it's extremely thoughtful, and I know that he has a tremendous amount of success as a teacher. My concern is that people have so much of a focus on grammar that balance that Nathan was talking about, with the communication being primary, can very quickly get thrown out of sync unless the teacher's really conscious about it. And I know Nathan's very conscious about it. So just two quick little comments again on Nathan. He made the point that Vygotsky was saying thinking and speaking are completely separate. And in reading it, it's really easy to come to that conclusion. What Vygotsky was saying was not so much that they were completely separated, but that they had distinct paths of development. Within those distinct paths of development, there is speaking and thinking or languaging and thinking that's taking place as a fundamental part of that distinct path of development, because you can't, even the gesturing, the animals thinking and animals communicating, those are things, they are thinking as part of that communicating. And the same thing holds true with the development of language for young children. So this is where the dialectical thinking is so important. They are distinct but united. And so it's that distinction that Vygotsky was pointing out that's really important to understand the unification. Because if we don't understand the paths of development, then it's extremely difficult to understand the true nature of that unification. And so formal logic would say, most people, and we are trained to think formally, we would think, okay, that you can't have something that's the same and different at the same time. Vygotsky's saying you can. The languaging and thinking processes are different, but the same. So, and then one last piece on the ZPD and children. The point is not that Vygotsky didn't think that the concept of the ZPD didn't apply to adults. I think that he thought that it was a fundamental part of our entire existence, as all of you are you're experiencing your zone of proximal development. Your thinking, hopefully, is developed. Well, I'm not going to say hopefully because I know it is in developing in this seminar. And the way it's happening is that you're bringing your experience in, and you get some of Vygotsky's thinking, and then I try to help to, I don't like the word scaffold because it implies you build a structure and then you take it down. Whereas I think it's a lot more of a process of teachers and students jointly from the very beginning building the concept. And so, but that interaction hopefully has helped you to understand it. So the key thing is that the zone of proximal development changes with every qualitative transformation that takes place in the periods in child development. And we have to understand that it's not a concept that just runs through. It's not a general concept like, cultural capital, a general concept. It's specific to that situation in which the child is developing and has developed. That's what he talks about, a social situation of development. It's the unity between where the child is, their affect, their perishavanya, their experience, and the actual situation. And that combination then will change during these qualitative transformations. So he looks at the one, and we look at it in our reading in just a minute, that takes place in adolescence. But he doesn't talk about the nature of the zone of proximal development as it applies to adults. And for those of you who are teaching adults, what you need to think about is, what is the difference between the thinking of adolescence that you've run into today and experienced as teachers or individuals and your students? And that's fundamental to understanding their particular zone of proximal development, because it isn't just the interaction that sets the zone of proximal development. It's the understanding of the thinking process that the students are using and how that thinking process can be facilitated by you by doing things like Nathan was talking about with the task-based, having them figure it out in authentic communication. So I will stop there. And now what we're going to do, some of you have come in a little bit late, and Nathan, I don't know if Catherine, who just came in, Kate, is in an interest group, but
Yeah,
what we're going to do,
I think.
okay. So what we're going to do is, and I want somebody, or maybe each person in the interest group, to note this down. What we're going to do is, most of you have done sort of a quick reading of the 3 pages in today's reading from page 146 to the end. And on page 146 for interest group 1, now do you have them, Nate? Do you have them labeled by 1 in the breakout rooms?
Yeah, and then they can see what group they are. So I made.
Okay, great. So for interest group 1, you will read from that last paragraph in section 9, beginning with coincidence and composition. You'll read that, and then the next paragraph on the first paragraph in section 10. Then number 2 will read the paragraphs that start with the first full paragraph on 147, that which disintegrates, and go down to the those two paragraphs, the bottom one where there's a quote from Lenin, I believe it is, and complete collected works. So that's 2. 3 will go from thus, that paragraph, and then one more paragraph, and actually, you'll read through those paragraphs and end with the the first full paragraph on page 148, if we try. Group 4 will go from we recall that internal speech and read three paragraphs. Group number 5 will start with the paragraph that has Hegel express this beautifully, and then go down to, and read 3 paragraphs. Group number 6 will start with the last little fragment of a paragraph on page 148 in this sense, and read to the end of the chapter. So your assignment is to go into the reading, give everybody a time to sort of quickly read through it. It's more of a skimming, just that hopefully you have marginal notes or underlining. Just read the whole thing so you get a feel for it. Then you individually can start reading your assigned paragraphs. So, because different people will read at different speeds. So everybody individually reads their section, and then begins making notes. And then when everybody's had a chance to finish, you then can begin having a discussion. And I would like one person to take notes of the discussion. And when we come back, we'll go into, I will go through that reading and give you my thoughts on it. But what I'd like each interest group is to do is to just a short, paragraph 2, bullet points, things that your interest group focused on, and then you'll post that in the discussion forum on, I think it's discussion from interest groups 4.2 is the way the title, something like that. So are there any questions?
Okay,
So-
if you want to go into the groups, it's very easy. In 10, 15 seconds, you will get something on your screen that just says enter room. That's all you have to do, and just click on it. And then you will be in a separate room with your classmates or with your interest group partners. And then when it's over in 20, 25 minutes, it will say return to room. And even if you don't push anything, it will take you back in 60 seconds.
And so we could do this till, let's say, 10 past 6. Is that
Okay, so I'm gonna make the breakout rooms right now, and some people won't get put in them right away. Don't worry, the late people, I will add you guys. Okay, everyone should be able to join their own groups. And Holbrook, I put you in your own separate group
right?
because
And-
I can't leave. You have to be in one. There's no.
Yeah, I just said later.
Okay.
Would you stop recording?
Yeah.